This conference will now be recorded.
So I guess we're starting. Somebody hit the record button. So good afternoon, everyone. We're calling this meeting to order, the Ethics Committee of the West Basin Municipal Water District. We do have both members present, as well as actually all 5 directors are present. So any public comment? Patrick.
Director Houston, yeah, good afternoon, Chair and members of the board and public. I have not received any requests for public comment, no.
Okay, great. So any presentations? Looks like none.
None.
Okay, so we'll move into the action calendar, item 5A.
Yes, well, we have a single item on the action calendar, which is a follow-up to prior discussions at the I think it was the last ethics committee some months ago, and our general counsel, Steve O'Neill, is going to present on this matter.
Okay, great. Thanks, Patrick. Good afternoon, everyone. And I wanted to report on, to follow up from the last meeting of the ethics committee in October, where the board had a discussion concerning the administrative code and also had a discussion concerning conduct issues. And as you may recall, we amended the admin code to include language discouraging, inconsiderate or discourteous behavior at the board level. And we were also instructed to come back to the board with a report of examples of what's considered misconduct or conduct unbecoming. And you'll see in the, and also we have another issue to address that's somewhat related, and it addresses how issues get to the issues concerning conduct get to the board agenda. So if you look at the exhibits attached to the agenda, we went to a variety of different agencies to try and get examples of conduct unbecoming, that's considered to be rude or discourteous. And
what packet page are you on?
It's really difficult to identify such behavior in the abstract. It could be very, it always is contextual. And I refer to the discussion we have with the simple sentence, for example, how did you get a job in a place like this? That could be considered a compliment by some people, given how it's phrased. Or perhaps it could be considered an insult and be considered rude or discourteous. So the long and short of it is, in our view, trying to predefine rude or discourteous behavior is really, really challenging, and we advise against it. And in our view, the best way to approach this is on an ad hoc basis with context in mind. And as we've done in the past, if the board as a body identifies some behavior it determines to be rude or discourteous to others, then it can be addressed at that time. But it's really a hard thing to put a net around in terms of predefining what kind of conduct would be considered rude or discourteous. I think we're moving forward. Our recommendation is that we're going to have to rely on common sense and the context of the situation. And this can, as we'll discuss further in this meeting, if an issue like this comes up, we'd like to get it before the board for the board to consider. Another issue that was discussed was, what remedies the board had if it made a determination that the majority of the board was felt it necessary to take some action in terms of board conduct. And as you know, the remedy of censure is available, and in fact, the board has employed it previously, and that is essentially a public statement of disapproval of the conduct. Outside of censure, there are very few remedies available. As you know, all the board members are elected officials, and the ultimate remedy is the electorate. We've seen other examples of limitations on director benefits or perquisites like travel, conference attendance, and things like that. But again, to try and determine or preset any kind of discipline in advance, we feel is a very kind of challenging, and it's kind of a fraught process. And we recommend again that if these issues arise, they be brought to the board's attention and dealt with by the board in the context in which it occurred. So before I turn to the administrative code, I just want to conclude that section of my report back from the October request. And of course, would be happy to entertain any questions.
Sure, thank you, Steve. And is there any questions at this moment? Well, first, the member, Desi, Director Alvarez, if you have any questions.
I don't have any questions right now. Still kind of just thinking about it, but kind of have to agree with Steve's comments. Very difficult to really put everything in a short one sentence as to what constitutes inappropriate behavior. It's a very contextual. I go back, I think, to something that was said by one Supreme Court justice when the whole issue of trying to define pornography and so on. How do you define it? And it's kind of, well, you'll know it's pornographic when you see it, but aside from that, it's very hard to actually put a definition of it. And the other thing is that even when we talk about context, things change. Remember, for those of you who remember George Carlin, there was the 7 words that couldn't be said, but they're routinely said today as a matter of course, and people are no longer offended by them. So when we think about these things, we need to keep a very open mind and recognize that we have to look at it. Was something said that was really, really inappropriate? What was the context it was said in, etc. But when people sometimes just say some things that other people may say, oh, I don't like that statement. Well, you got to keep in mind that we all express ourselves differently, and we're all entitled to expressing ourselves differently. That's one of the great things about living in the United States.
Okay, great. Thank you, Director Alvarez. Other board members, comments?
This is Don Deere. I agree. Desi was very well spoken on the issue and some very good comments. I don't think we need to over legislate this issue. That's all I have.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah. Director, Chair Houston, can you hear me?
Yes, Director Gray.
Yeah. Steve, it was kind of hard to even hear what Steve was saying because the phone kept breaking up the words, but I didn't hear exactly everything. But I certainly acknowledge the comments that my board members have said, and you're right, we can't overthink it, but words do matter. But I didn't hear exactly Steve's report. I just want to say that, and then we'll see what happens further on in the meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Director Gray. Anybody else? Director Williams?
Yeah, I would just say that I agree with everything that has been said, but the most important thing is that words do matter, and things that are said can either become a blessing or a curse. So we nevertheless, we are free to express ourselves, but we just, as elected officials, we have to just be on guard to make sure that things aren't said that we'd be horrified about later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And basically, I do concur as well. And that was one of the questions that came up, I think, back in October of last year when this committee last met, was what constitutes rude. And everyone's going to have a different idea of what's rude. And I saw in Steve's write-up, of course, that a lot of agencies don't try to, put into words what they call rude. You'll know it when you see it and you address it. So I think that that's where we should be at, and I agree with that, Steve. So okay, you wanted to move on. You said you had another portion, Steve, I think.
Yes, thank you, Director Houston. At page 20 of 20 of the board packet, we have two sections of the administrative code, both of which concern how items that concern the code of conduct get agendized. And you'll see that we have section 2-1.303 that I think is a section most of you are very familiar with, where we state that individual directors can request an item be added to an agenda, and the agenda item will reflect the name of the director making the request. So, of course, the board has approved that policy in the past, and it allows for great flexibility in the board to, get attention to an item if a board member feels he or she wants something agendized. However, we also have another section 2-1.306. Which is in the also in the code of conduct, but it concerns the ethics committee, and it has to do with any perceived violations of the code, or real violations, should be reported to the general manager or an ethics committee member, who will then in turn agendize any potential violations for the next board meeting. So we have this a bit of a conflict here, and we wanted to get some guidance from the committee for a recommendation to the board about an administrative code change. As you see, the first attempt that we have in the red line on 2-1.303, we have implemented or suggest implementing a carve out to say that with the exception of any items dealing with the code of conduct and like issues that may be appropriate for the ethics committee, with the exception of those, any individual director can get something on the agenda. So that would be one way to reconcile these two statutes. Because if you did that and a board member came upon a perceived or real violation of the admin code, or the code of conduct, then that director would have to go and follow existing 2-1.306, which says that if a director comes upon such an issue, he's got to report it to the GM or an ethics committee member, each of whom, upon getting that notice, would have to put this on for the next scheduled board meeting. So that's one approach we recommend to reconcile, or we could keep the existing language that says any board member can get something on the agenda, but amend 2-1.306 ethics committee to state that any violation of the code have to be reported, and then we'll just get right to the next board meeting. So looking for some guidance on that. I know it's a little confusing, but there is a subtle difference that we actually identified in the October ethics committee meeting. And so we just wanted to get some feedback on that, what the board's pleasure is, and we could move forward once we get some direction.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve. I'll go to Director Alvarez first, and then the other board members. Director Alvarez, comments, questions?
I guess I have a question. I'm a little bit at a loss to understand the actual need for the change. I mean, I can read the existing code and then the proposed changes that you're making to them. I'm going, they're not of substance. What's the intent, and why is this even needed?
Well, because right now, if something came up, actually it arose in this context, and now that I think about it, Director Alvarez, it was, I think, before you were elected, because we discussed this in October. There was an issue on a code of conduct violation, and as I recall, I think it went a director asks it to be put on the agenda, on a board agenda, and without being run through committee or ethics committee. And that act was consistent with 2-1.303, which allows any individual board member to request an item. But given the nature of these, as I recall the discussion, given the nature of these potential violations, it's code of conduct, it's ethics, there was a discussion that maybe it's better that these be run through the ethics committee first, as opposed to going right to a board agenda. Do you see the distinction?
It's very subtle. It's basically, there would be because this really addresses the board, if I kind of understanding this properly.
Yeah.
And that the board member, instead of, if it's a code of conduct type of issue, instead of bringing it up as an item for the board under board member comments and requests, they would then bring it up and direct it first to the ethics committee. And then it would, and depending on how it goes to the ethics committee, it would then be heard by the board or not. So that's the net change, is that instead of a director, for example, at the next board meeting, if I had an issue that I thought was a code of conduct violation, I would say I would like to agendize the violation XYZ for the next ethics committee as opposed to for the next board meeting. Is that about it?
I see the point you identified, but there's one other factor that is, I think the board needs to consider, is that the ethics committee, you may know, does not meet as regularly as your regular standing committees. Patrick, are we meeting quarterly or twice a year now? I forget. Is it? I think it's twice a year.
Twice a year.
Yeah, we were originally meeting on a quarterly basis, and the board decided that was, was meeting. It didn't really need to meet on a quarterly basis, so we changed it to, biannually. So it meets twice a year now, and so running things through the ethics committee does have a timing element attached to it, if you see.
Well, could that just be addressed? And I don't want to add more language in the, because a committee, even though they may regularly meet once a year, twice a year, or whatever the frequency of the meeting is, can meet at any time that the chairperson of that committee calls a meeting, correct? So if we do that,
yes,
it would be the same thing. As a board member, you would bring this up under that first modification and say, okay, I just would like the ethics committee to consider this, and that should be done next month, and request that the ethics committee meet sooner rather than later, as opposed to, waiting 6 months to address the issue.
Absolutely. That could, the chair of the ethics committee could do that, could call that.
Okay. Anything else on that?
That's my question. Like I said, it was more for my understanding of kind of the background here, because you seemed.
Okay.
I had no background to it.
Yeah.
Oh, good. No. Let me jump in for a moment. I wholly agree with the way Steve characterized it, because the challenge was back in October, we realized that our code basically says two different things on this particular item. So you have an ethics committee. On the one hand, it really kind of tells you bring things to ethics, but on the other hand, yes, our code does allow us to put anything on the board agenda at any time. So theoretically, someone could just go straight to the board meeting with whatever their concern was, put it on the agenda, and it's not really had an opportunity to be vetted potentially through the committee. So in my opinion, that's what we have an ethics committee for. And I think something that's, like a code of conduct violation probably should first go to ethics and then be forwarded to the board, rather than just put straight on the agenda. So that was where this came up. I personally, I agree with the top option on this page that Steve has come up with. I think that would be the best approach. But I'll open it up to other comments or questions from directors.
This is Director Gray. May I?
Yes, Director Gray, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand. Any item can be placed on the board agenda by a board member if there's a code of conduct issue that comes up. And what I heard is that it could be referred to the ethics committee before it goes to the full board. But the ethics committee meets quarterly or whatever time it does. And I also thought I heard that Steve said that the chair of the ethics committee can call a meeting at any time. Is that true? Can any committee call a meeting at any time?
Well, the ethics committee is a standing committee that by board action has been changed from quarterly to biannually. However,
Right.
in the event that something arose that needed to be addressed, I wouldn't see any problem with convening. I guess it would be a special ethics committee meeting to address the issue that's raised.
Yeah, but my question is, can any committee do that? Because we have standing committees, like any standing committee. The ethics committee is one we're talking about, but the question is, can any standing committee call a meeting at any time? Any standing committee, not just the ethics committee.
Yeah, the only restriction on that, Director Gray, is the Brown Act. And if we called such a meeting, of course, we'd have to comply with the Brown Act notice requirements.
Oh, I understand, right. So any committee, and is it up to the chair, or does the president of the board have to approve that committee calling that meeting?
Right now, if a violation of the or potential violation of the code of conduct is perceived by a director, it's to be reported to the general manager or an ethics committee member who will agendize it for the next scheduled ethics committee. We have the word schedule in there, which assumes that it'll be on the set schedule for the meeting twice a year. However, if it's a meeting of critical importance, I would hope that the general manager or the ethics committee member would take action to schedule it, in a more reasonable time. But of course, if that took place, it would have to be done with the required Brown Act notice.
Yeah, and I know the language says what it does say, but if it's left up to the authority of whomever to make that decision, then there could be an issue. But still, any item can be placed on the agenda by a board member. That still stands, period, correct?
That's what we have currently, but what the recommendation is, or one of the alternatives proposed, is that there's a carve out in that language if it involves a code of conduct violation.
Then it's treated a little bit differently, correct?
Yeah, it would first be run through ethics committee and then get to the board. And
right.
As I recall, if this is helpful, Director Gray, as I recall the discussion, that generally this would tend to be kind of a sensitive matter, and this discussion we just had about context and what constitutes a potential violation. It's fact specific and contextual, and one would presume that vetting it through a committee first could resolve any of those contextual issues, and give the board a chance, or the committee a chance, to make a recommendation to the board, rather than having it being vetted at a full board meeting without any preparation.
Yeah, and I like that process. I'm just trying to make sure that it's not stuck with the ethics committee trying to decide whether or not they want to hear it, that it has no other place to go, that if it's not heard by the ethics committee, then it still could go to the board. So that's the reason why I'm asking you all of these questions. But I agree, it should go to the committee because it should be vetted and discussed before it goes to the full board. But I'm trying to make sure it's not stuck with ethics in the sense of the timing or any other issue.
Yeah, now I'm look at if you look at 2-1.306, the ethics committee shall meet semi-annually or as needed to address compliance issues. So we're
Great, as
not
needed.
making a
Okay.
change to that. So it's as needed. And I think this also addresses Director Alvarez's issue.
Okay. Makes great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Let's see. Who did I miss? Oh, Director Deere or Williams? Anything?
None for me. I see that we always have the option that anything that's sent to the full board with a recommendation that the board could refer item back to committee or whatever. So it seems like we're covered to me.
Okay, Director Deere.
No, nothing else to say. Thank you.
Okay, great. No, I think that I think Director Gray brought up a good point, Steve. I mean, again, the situation is the way I understood it, our current code allows you to do two different things, right? So we really have to fix something. That's the way I interpreted this, because basically, you know, we're told you see a problem, report to ethics. But at the same time, theoretically, you could just go straight to the board and just throw it on the agenda this month or whatever, and there is no vetting, there's nothing. I think Director Gray makes a very good point. You wouldn't want it to get stuck in a committee, so there's probably got to be a go around if the committee decides not to act, I suppose. But also, and you already mentioned this, the committee can meet as needed. That's certainly my assumption. The way things would work is if someone had a problem, they would report it to the general manager, to you. I think you're listed in ethics as well, general counsel, I think.
In terms of the code as we have it, it's any violations are to be reported to the GM or an ethics committee member.
Okay, got it. Okay, so the person could go to the GM, they could go to the chair or the member of this committee. They got three people to talk to that would basically bring it to the attention of the committee, and theoretically that committee should, you know, hold a meeting and deal with it in a timely manner. That's theoretic. I guess my only thing would be, again, I think it needs to be fixed. I think it should be going to the first option on this page, because like what you said, sometimes these might be sensitive matters. Sometimes it should just go to a committee to be discussed or get some more information rather than just thrown on a board meeting. In a very large open session, because again, anybody could just do that. So how would you look at trying to make sure that, hey, what if the committee didn't want to meet or didn't meet, or wants to say, oh, you know, 6 months from now we'll do this? Is there a go around that, yes, the board member would have the option to say, okay, I got to put this on the agenda. This is, you know, time sensitive or something.
Well, if we made the change to 303 that's presented, which is the carve out, you can get anything on the agenda when you want. We're carving out a code of conduct violation. If we make that change and something comes up that is a code of conduct violation, we'll have the existing 306 be intact, and that says that if there's any violations, they have to be reported to the general manager or an ethics committee member, and any such violations would be agendized for the next scheduled ethics committee meeting. So it would, if it got to the, and your hypothetical is that there is a code of conduct violation and it's not reported, what would happen?
My hypothetical would be if it was reported to the committee, but the committee, whoever was on it, decided they don't want to meet, you know, for 2, 3, 4 months, what have you, right? I mean, maybe they don't call a meeting.
Yeah.
So maybe what we're talking about is a bit of a hybrid of these two, because I heard what you said. You're coming down on 306 at the end. You're saying reported to the general manager and ethics committee member, who will agendize it. Instead of at the next scheduled board meeting, it might be at the next scheduled ethics meeting, or you know, scheduled or
Yeah, it would be, it's, that strikeout language, Director Houston, is the existing language. So there's a mandatory duty to agendize it at the next Ethics Committee
Oh,
meeting.
okay. Oh, you're right. You're right. So maybe then maybe that should just stay the same.
Yeah, that 306 would stay the same if we make the change to 303.
Yes. So that, okay, I get it. So that seems like that would work, right?
Yeah, I'd recommend that. I think it's the cleanest. And it's very, I think it gives very clear direction to the board that, sure, yeah, you can get anything on the agenda you want.
Yeah.
But if you think it involves a code of conduct, a violation of the code of conduct, then it's got to be on the ethics committee, and you got to report it to the GM or an ethics committee member.
Yes. Okay. Because you're right. I think I was looking at this as either or because it said or as an alternative.
Yeah,
But
yeah, I
yours
know,
said
sorry, it's a little.
fix. You do number one like we got it on top. Then on the bottom, you would not strike out.
Correct.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. To me, that seems like that would solve our issue. Right?
Yeah, if there's consensus, we can go ahead and make this change and move it forward for the June consent calendar, I guess.
Yeah. I would concur with that.
Actually, I think it would be an action item. I think we
I
need a resolution.
have a question.
Okay. Yes, Director Alvarez.
So what are we saying right now? And I'm a little bit confused and I apologize. So we're going to confirm the language change is proposed in the striked out version that is presented under 2-1.3037E.
Yes, if we confirm that, then 306 will be unchanged. And interpreting those red lines in 306, you need to consider that the underline language is an addition. The strikeout language is existing. So that if we make the change to 303, we wouldn't have to change 306.
Right, 306 then remains unchanged.
Correct.
Next.
You said, I guess I'll go back to my earlier comment. It seems a very minor change that, and I'll go back to what President Williams said. If it's brought up at a board meeting, the president of the board can direct it to a committee.
Yeah, but if we make this change, it would, any suspected violation would go to the ethics committee first before it got to the board. And of course, the board, once it gets to the board can always send it back to a committee. That's correct.
Right.
So if this helps, I know this language is a little dense, but if this helps, if Director Jones suspects there's a code of conduct violation, Director Jones cannot just request that be put on a board agenda. Director Jones would have to report to the general manager or an ethics committee member the perceived violation, and then either or both of those individuals would have to agendize this suspected violation for the next ethics committee meeting. And that ethics committee meeting does not need to be semi-annually. If there's a determination that it needs to meet earlier, an ethics committee can be convened. Does that sequence give a little more light to this subject?
Director Alvarez?
I like you said, it seems like it makes it a little more convoluted, to be honest about it.
Well, let me opine really fast. The problem is basically our code says two different things. So I think that it does need to be fixed because it on the one hand, it says if you see a problem, you take it to the ethics committee, but yet we always have the option to just go straight to the board. But I think for like code violations, it probably should go to the ethics committee first to get a good vetting before it's put on a full board agenda, and just be dealt with, immediately without any vetting. And that unfortunately is the type of thing that has happened before in the past and probably could happen again. So I think it's a good stopgap personally. It's just like in Congress, you know, you see a problem, you send it to the ethics committee. Yes, you're at the whim of the people on the ethics committee and other things, but at the same time, there's a process. Because the one last part is obviously, you know, depending on board dynamics and who's on the board now or in the future, if someone just has an issue or is upset about something, theoretically, they could just throw it on a board agenda and we all have to talk about it at a monthly board meeting. And sometimes it would probably be better to run that through a committee where, you know, it gets properly vetted before it gets to the full board.
Well, let's say
You know,
Renee-
Mr. Chair. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Director Williams.
Yeah, go ahead, Director Williams.
You know, I was going to just say that I would agree with you, but we have committee meetings that are similar to what we're having now. Every board member can be at that committee meeting. So we're not holding anything back by sending it to the board or not. Excuse me, by sending it to the board or not sending it to the board, because when the committee meets, we all meet. So it's not like something's being held back. So I don't understand why this is a big issue.
Okay, Director Alvarez, did you have something else at the moment, or?
I was going to say, even if you do the change that's proposed for 2-13037E, it still doesn't preclude an individual board member from raising an issue at a board meeting, and eventually the board would, at that board meeting, says, okay, well, this is something that needs to go to the ethics committee. So it's maybe because I don't have a background in any of this and I'm coming at it cold, it seems like we're adding language that doesn't make a substantial difference.
Well, let me step in for just one moment, because again, what we found, at least, and I've been on the board for what, 6-something years, is there were different conflicts in language within this code that we've identified over time, right, Steve?
Yeah, like any administrative code, it's always adapted, and it's an organic document.
So literally in October, last time this committee met, we actually realized that this was in our code. It's telling us to do two different things, which are in conflict. Yes, ultimately, if something got through the ethics, or this is a public meeting, so of course in ethics, but there's only 2 members of ethics that make recommendations to the full board. But these are still public meetings, so no one's trying to hide anything. But I'm trying to look at the code has a problem in it. So that's one. I think some language has to be fixed. But 2, again, at the end of the day, any director could just put something on an agenda, you know, because they saw a reason or felt like it, if you think about it, and all of a sudden there it is, and everyone's got to discuss it when it hasn't even been vetted. So I don't think that that's the best way we should do things. I believe other agencies and organizations a lot of times also do, they send it to ethics. I mean, that's the point of an ethics committee. So for me, I'm trying to look at, we should fix this language one way or the other. Or you know what, you got to take it out of the language, then they don't report it to the ethics committee, right, Steve? Why would they report something to the ethics committee if you could put it to the full board? Just report it to any director and the general manager, I guess, right? We got to fix this language somehow. That's how I feel. So I think what we need to do is we make a decision. Does it go to the ethics committee or does it go straight to board? That's what we've got to figure out here.
But it doesn't seem like it's right now. If it goes to the board can direct it to the ethics committee.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and that's a good. Yeah, go ahead, Steve. That's a good thought.
If this helps, Director Alvarez, that discussion we had previously about context. As I recall the October discussion on this item, um, when an individual director could bring anything and request that it be added to a board agenda um, um, without any evaluation of, as it addresses code of conduct things, without any evaluation or review of that matter. My recollection from the October discussion was that the board was interested in having a bit of a vetting or a two-step process for such issues, and that by routing things through the ethics committee first would be best practice instead of having it just agendized, as a board item. And that's what this is, because right now, if a director said, "Hey, I think this is someone violated the travel policy. I want this put on the agenda." The general manager gets that direction, and he looks at the code of conduct, which covers your travel policy, and when you look at the ethics committee language, that should go to the ethics committee as it exists now. That alleged violation should go to the next scheduled ethics committee meeting and not go directly to the board. So that's the inconsistency. That's how it manifests as a practical matter at the staff level. So if you called Patrick and said, "Hey, someone violated the travel policy," that's a code of conduct violation. When you look at the ethics committee language, as it stands now, the general manager has to put that on the next ethics committee meeting. So the general manager has two directions here. Under 303, he has to put it on the agenda. Under 306, he's got to put it on the ethics committee agenda. So that's the inconsistency that we have.
Well, if somebody calls the general manager and reports it and is put on the ethics committee, why is that in conflict with 303 if they don't bring it up at the board meeting? There's no conflict.
Let's say in the situation where we are in advance of a board meeting, the individual director perceives a code of conduct violation and says to Patrick, "Hey, put this on the board agenda." Under 303. Patrick can look at that language and say, "Okay, this should get on the board agenda." However, he can look at 306, which identifies any perceived violations of the code of conduct, and that tells Patrick to put it on the ethics committee. So there's tension there there's two different paths that are being described for a potential code of conduct violation. And what we're trying to rectify today is which path do we want to take? And that's what this suggested language addresses.
Okay, well, I just learned something. I always thought that if I wanted to put something on the agenda as a director, that I had to wait till a board meeting, and under the director's comments and requests for items, that's the opportunity. That I did not know that a director could call the general manager directly and put something on the board agenda, that would only be to the privilege of the board president who directs the board agenda. But I'm glad I know that now.
Yeah, this was if you look at in the packet on page 20 of 20, Director Alvarez, 2-13037E, the existing language starts with the word individual, the black in the black print.
Right.
So
but
years ago,
I always read that as an individual board member, I had the right under board of directors' comments and future direction. That's where I would bring up any items that a director would want to put in a future agenda.
No, you have both.
I just learned something new. Thank you.
So let me jump in because I think that's an extremely important point. And yes, Director Alvarez, see, that's with the way our board works is that any board member can put something on the monthly agenda, and it doesn't have to be asked at a meeting. we can call or email Patrick, or certain times maybe legal counsel and ask something to be agendized, and basically it gets agendized. And there's some great beauty in that. It makes it really nice and convenient for all of us. But at the same time, that's what brought up this problem, because our code literally tells the general manager that, if something's reported to him or the ethics committee, oh, it needs to go to ethics because they broke the code, potentially. Or by default, you could just put it on the board agenda. You could override that, right? What if a director said, you know what, I don't want to deal with the ethics committee. I'm just going to go straight, put it on the board. And one last thing on this, because for example, and this is why this came out of the conversation, was back in October, well, what constitutes rude? So we adjusted some language in our code and it got approved, and we say, but that's subjective too, right? It's rude, but theoretically, if I thought someone said something really rude or insulting to me, I could have it agendized at the next board meeting and talk about it. And once it's on the board agenda, of course, then you got to, potentially take action. It's just all out there, etc. So that's why I think the best path is the code needs to be fixed one way or the other. So we all have clear motivation of, if you see a problem, where does it go? And I think the best way is it goes to the ethics committee for the first glance, first look, gets vetted, and then can move forward to the full board with a recommendation or no recommendation. But again, where at least it gets a chance to be understood with some more context, rather than just throw it on a monthly board meeting. Because I just see potential that, people, it could go where you don't want to go sometimes, because theoretically every month someone could put something on there and they felt somebody was violating codes and stuff, and then we're having these conversations. I think it'd be better to go to the committee when those things come up. So I just think we're trying to fix this language in our own code. What's the best course of action? And lastly, we don't necessarily have to decide this today. Maybe we have Steve look at this a little bit further, and we can have another meeting in a handful of weeks or months. But I right at this time, the code, it's telling you two different things of what to do as a director who sees a problem. Okay, go ahead. I hear Director Williams.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh. Anybody else thoughts? I mean, maybe we just punt this and have Steve look at some more and try and figure this out. I don't know.
Well, there's not much more to look at. So it's either we move this forward or we're not. If you want to move forward with the suggested language of 2-13037E, I guess that's fine. I just find that it seems to be a very minor change, but it does clarify that.
Right. What I would say, and it is minor, but unfortunately it's just not clear. And but I think, Steve, your suggestion was ideal, that if we did the fix that you put on the upper paragraph in .303, but then you keep the language in 306, right? You
Correct.
Don't do the strike. Yeah.
Right.
And then that means it goes to ethics. An ethics committee can be called and at least fixes the language in our code.
Right.
So
Just a point of clarification. I don't see anything here that would preclude a director still under director items to bring up an item that would then, everybody would say that should go to the ethics committee because you're really dealing with the code of conduct. But it still would be discussed at the board meetings. It'd be brought up under director's comments, and there's nothing to preclude a director from bringing it up at that point in any case.
That's right.
That's correct. That's correct.
True.
So that's why I don't think, I think this language is very minor, and at the end of the day, it makes absolutely no difference.
Well, again, in advance of a meeting, it makes a big difference to staff about what gets on an agenda and where that item ends up. That hypothetical we addressed, if there's a perceived violation of the code, a director calls the general manager and says, put this on the board agenda. and general managers could decide which way do I go? Do I go, does it have to go to the ethics committee as 306 tells me, or do I have to go to 303 as, um, uh, and just put it on a board agenda? So I see your point,
I
Dr. Alvarez.
understand that, but I go back to the point that that still doesn't preclude that a director from not bringing it up to the general manager or to an ethics committee meeting, and to just bring it up under director's comments and say, I feel that there was a violation of the travel policy by director so-and-so, and here's why I feel that, and that forces the board to discuss it.
Right.
Well,
Well, again,
no.
if a board member brings it up under board member comments, that is not, of course, an action item. So the board would not be able to act on it at that time. So there is a slight difference there, but this language does not, our suggestion or suggested edit does not prevent a director from getting something on a board agenda if he or she desires it, with the exception of a code of conduct violation, which will be routed to the ethics committee for consideration.
Right. Yeah, because this is what it does is there's the one carve out that, if it's a code of conduct violation, it would be reported, through the process to the ethics committee to go through the motions and look at that.
Well,
So, I mean, again, I agree. I don't know who's tapping, but I agree with the language that's here, with the fix on, the first paragraph at the top, and then again at the bottom, you would instead leave the striked out language, right, Steve? You just leave it as is, that it will be agendized in the next scheduled ethics committee meeting. Because again, this would solve our problem in the code that literally tells you have to do two different things. If it didn't, we wouldn't be even having this conversation.
That's correct.
So, right. So, I mean, otherwise, if we just leave it, it's broken. It's still broken. So,
Well,
go ahead.
actually, now that I read it again, you would want to modify 306, 2-1 306A1. You would want to strike out next scheduled ethics committee, because back to the issue that you mentioned earlier, that the ethics committee schedule is semi-annual, even though there's actual language above that says that it meets semi-annual or as needed. So instead of it going back to the next scheduled ethics committee meeting, we would just go back to an ethics committee and take out next schedule. Because otherwise, you bring up the issue of a travel violation, of the code of conduct violation under travel, and the ethics committee just met, and the next scheduled meeting, according to the way this would read now, is 6 months away.
No, it could be 6 months or it could be next week. If it's needed, that would be a scheduled meeting pursuant to the Brown Act. And these committee meetings are also joint special meetings of the board. So under the Brown Act, it's 24 hours notice. I see the issue, Director Alvarez, with the word scheduled in the language. We could make that edit as well to 2306 with the proposed edit for 303.
Yeah, I hadn't noticed it till I read it again. And so what? That says next scheduled, and it's a conflict there. But I mean, these are really minor things. We're starting to dig deep into the weeds.
No, you're exactly right, Director Alvarez, but as you know too, in policy, sometimes these things, language matters, right? And then you get pulled in things. So I don't know what remedy you have on that, Steve, but rather than say next scheduled, it just will be agendized at the ethics committee or something like that, right? I mean, we know that this committee technically only meets 2 times a year, but there's nothing that precludes us from meeting more times a year. Nothing.
Well, it's right there. It's above. It says or as needed.
There you go.
Semi-annually or as needed.
Right. So no one should be scared by the next scheduled meeting as far as that goes. But I don't know, Steve, did you have a thought on how to tweak that at all or not?
Well, I could, yeah, I mean, in my mind, it's not ambiguous, but if it's the board's pleasure, I could strike the word scheduled from 306 and go with the proposed edit to 303.
Right. Ethics committee meeting, which need to be agendized for the ethics, right? Okay, and at the bottom, you would just say member who will agenda any suspected potential violations, and then just will be agendized.
At the next ethics committee meeting.
Yeah, take the word scheduled out, right?
Okay,
Does that seems like it would fix this, right?
yes.
I mean, does that seem okay, Director Alvarez?
Yeah, just like you said, we're really getting deep into the weeds here.
I know. I know.
That's
Go
what
ahead.
you're supposed to do here.
And
Good.
Director Houston, I know the ethics committee is also, as you know, we've noticed this as a special meeting of the board of directors. So if it's the board's pleasure, at this special meeting, you'll see the recommendation is to adjust the code of conduct as the board decides. So if this is the board's pleasure, we'd need a motion to make the suggested amendments to 2-1303 and 2-1306 with the exception of the word scheduled as exhibited on page 20 of the board packet.
Okay, so you're saying we could just do this all today and vote on it and be done with it, or we still move it?
No, as opposed to moving this to the board for recommendation, we could make this, you could give me instruction to do this now with a motion.
I would like to do so. May I do that?
Okay. All right. Well,
No,
I'm
you're not a member of the board. You're not a member of the committee. I thought.
No, I'm a member of the board, and it's just
Yeah,
wants a board motion.
But
want
I
to hear legal counsel.
Yeah, Director Williams, as you know, we notice our committee meetings as joint committee meetings and special meetings of the board. And
That's correct.
For most of
I
our
understand
standing
that.
for most of our standing committees, the we notice them also as joint special meetings. So in this case, we have a joint special meeting, and the board could act as the board itself and amend the code of conduct, or if we want, we can act as one of our other standing committees and move it forward for board consideration. Given that the notice for this meeting states that members who are not assigned to the ethics committee can attend and participate, we have noticed this meeting as an advisory committee meeting. So I'm looking at your language from page 1, and my recommendation is to make this a recommendation to the board and not act on it today. I'm withdrawing my prior advice. So my recommendation is to make this recommended change to the admin code to the full board for consideration.
Thank you very much, because it says here that the members of the ethics committee can vote on any item before the ethics committee today.
Yeah, and it's and I apologize for that oversight if it caused any confusion. But in the past, I know we've had ethics committees that I believe we did not include this language, and the ethics committee acted. But in this case, we still have the language that conditions the function of this committee. And my recommendation is to have the board members move this forward to the board for consideration at the next board meeting, and it'll be agendized.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve, for that clarification, because I was a little caught off guard there too. Normally, yeah, we just come to whatever consensus with the committee or what have you and move it forward. So I am good to move it forward with the noted changes you indicated, Steve. And if Director Alvarez concurs.
That's fine. I'll still say that I think this is really minor. At the end of the day, it's not going to change much of anything, but that's fine.
Great.
Yeah, Chairman Houston, I have a question if I may, if you.
Sure, General Manager.
Yes, thank you, Chair Houston. So I just want to make sure, so this would require, Steve, an accompanying resolution if we're proposing to change the admin code, is that correct?
That's correct. So we'll have the reso for the board meeting.
So we need a resolution. All right, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, great. Steve, just to keep me in order here, I have a couple other things I want to talk about, maybe for a future meeting, or is that something I bring up in my comments at the end since I'm the chair?
I think
did want to.
I'd recommend you do it under section 8.
Under which one?
Item 8.
Okay, perfect. Because I do want to go through a couple of the backups you had given us, and I had a couple things I'd like us to look at a future meeting. So is that where I would do that then?
Yeah, I think that'd be appropriate. Thanks.
Perfect. Just because it was all together in the packet, right, under one item, so I was a little confused. Okay, great. So we're past that, and thank you, Director Alvarez. Let's see. Information calendar. I don't think we have anything, correct, Pat?
That's correct.
Okay, closed session, no closed session, director's comments, future agenda items. I guess I'll just go around. Director Alvarez, do you have any comments at this time? Or future
I have no
agenda?
additional comments.
Okay, great. Any other board member?
No, thank you. No, thank you.
No, thank you. I have to leave. Thank you.
Okay, great. And Director Deere?
No comment.
Okay. So this will be probably mostly to Pat and Steve, but there were some interesting things that were in these backup materials from other organizations, whether they're cities or water districts. And I do think that a couple of these ought to probably be examined at some point for this committee and for the board in looking at our code. And so I guess I'll just go through the ones that I noted. So on page 11, and this comes from Upper San Gabriel Valley Water District's policy manual, page 11. At 3.1.12, there's two items, G and H. And it says here, the board of directors should maintain an appropriate but arm's length relationship with employees.
All right, baby, thank you.
Excessive personal contact between board members and employees is discouraged. And then the next part says board members may call or personally contact managerial employees without prior arrangement with the general manager. Board members are cautioned not to give direction to any employee without prior arrangement with the general manager. I thought that's interesting that they have that, how they codify it in their code. And I'd like to ask that that be one of the things we bring back to the next committee meeting of this. I understand sometimes those are unspoken, but it's interesting they put it in here. But I also think they have it in here that you could contact a managerial employee without prior arrangement with the general manager if needed. But it doesn't mean you're telling them what to do. So it's kind of interesting. But the other one is page 14. And this, let me go back where it comes from. This came from the Moreno Valley Council Rules of Procedure. So page 14, the last item, 5.5.7, dissents, protests, and comments. And it says any council member shall have the right to express dissent from or protest to or comment upon any action of the city council and have the reason entered into the minutes. If such dissent, protest, or comment is desired to be entered into the minutes, this should be made clear by language such as, quote, I would like the minutes to show that I'm opposed to this action for the following reasons, ... end of quote. I'd like us to look at that at our next meeting as well, because we've had this conversation back and forth as to what gets put in minutes or not, or what we can say at the meetings And they've clearly spelled out that, you know, we do have the right or ability, at least at this council, to add something to the minutes if we would like that. And again, these are for discussion at the next committee meeting, and then we can decide if we want to do anything with it or not. And I'm almost done. Page 15, the City of Rancho Palos Verdes, under general decorum, almost at the bottom, it says, officials should be able to assert policy positions and opinions without fear of reprisal from fellow officials or citizens. Officials should not question the ethics of other members because they disagree with that member on a question of policy. And I thought that was really well said, because actually it ironically goes to what we were just talking about, that sometimes someone could, in their own comments, question the ethics of a colleague in an open session. And that has happened before at our board meetings in the past. And so I think that that might be something we want to look at, some language there, because, you know, board members need to feel that they can speak comfortably on issues. And my last ones here, page 16, also from the City of Rancho Palos Verdes, and that's on censorship policy. And I don't know right now, Steve, you know, how much detail we have in our code on censorship, and that's why, again, this will go to a future ethics meeting. But the way they've structured it here on that page 16.9.4, and I think this is really important, is notice an opportunity to cure. You know, a council member may not be made the subject of a motion of censure without first being given notice of the alleged violation and an opportunity to correct the violation if it can be reasonably corrected. And then they go into 9.5, that, you know, because they give them initiated by a member only as saying council member initiate proceedings, the statement of charges, proceedings shall be commenced by the presentation of a written statement. So I would look at that 9.4, 9.5, and the 9.5 goes into the next page. And it says something along the lines of the statement of charges shall be given at least 10 days prior to the meeting at which the censure motion is proposed to be brought. So I see, and then goes into 9.8 as well, but at least they have a procedure for how censorship should be done within their city organization. I think that we should talk about that for this one, because again, theoretically, anybody could put something on the agenda and say, well, you know, I want to censure somebody at the end of the month, and it just gets posted to the agenda. So I think that we need to look at what our language says in our code right now, Steve, and what these options are, and have a discussion, because I really don't want to see that kind of thing happening at West Basin. You know, these things need to be vetted, and people need to have time to respond. So that's what I'm asking for the next committee meeting. I'm not sure when that meeting will be just yet, but does that make sense, Steve?
Yes.
Okay. And last but not least, I guess, is when will our next meeting be? Is it written at the bottom of our agenda or not?
Roughly, you know, if there's no as needed meetings, it would be 6 months from today.
Okay.
October 21st.
October 21st?
Let's say October 2021.
Okay. Oh, it says October 20.
2021.
My page got all mixed up on my desk. Okay. So I think that should work, right, Steve? Well, it just says October 2021. We don't have an official date. So I guess, how do we schedule that date at some point, Patrick?
Yeah,
I'm not gonna
well,
look at the calendar now, but
right, we'll have board services secure a date in October of 2021 to agendize. Well, we'll have to see if everybody's availability, but we should be able to do it within the entire month of October, and we would agendize the items that you brought up
okay, great.
for discussion.
Yes.
Okay, we got it.
Okay. All right. Is there any further comments or business? Director Alvarez or Director Deere?
None.
Very good.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you, Steve. I really appreciate the work on this. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.